The night I finally understood what it meant to be truly targeted by someone with just enough power to make your life miserable. I was standing in my own driveway in my pajamas at 11 o'clock, watching a woman photograph my car with the focused intensity of a detective at a crime scene.
I have to go,
That
now.
image, her face lit blue by her phone screen,
They're coming.
her
I
jaw
have to
set
hide.
like concrete,
Oh God,
became the beginning
not
of the
now.
most surreal 3 weeks of my entire
I knew
adult
this was a
life.
mistake.
My name is Daniel Marsh, and
I
I
have
had
to
lived in
get out of
Cedar
here.
Brook Estates for 4 years without a single complaint. Not one. My
Another
lawn was
quiet
mowed
night.
on a schedule. My trash bins were rolled in before sunset
Just
on
like old
collection day.
times.
My holiday decorations came down within the HOA-mandated 48-hour window after each holiday. I was, by every measurable standard, a model resident. I paid my HOA dues on time, attended 2 of the 3 annual meetings each year, and smiled and waved at my neighbors like a man who genuinely believed that community meant something. Cedar Brook Estates was the kind of neighborhood that looked peaceful from the outside.
The world keeps
Mature
moving out there.
oak trees lining the streets,
So much
well-maintained
life, so much
colonial-style
change.
homes, children riding bikes on Sunday afternoons.
I know
But
things have
underneath
been
that
hard.
manicured surface
Hard?
lived an
You walked
ecosystem
away.
of
I was scared. I
unspoken
came back.
hierarchies, petty
And now?
grievances,
Let me
and
make it
one woman
right.
who had appointed
I don't know
herself
if I
the
can.
moral conscience of the entire
I can't
community.
believe this.
Her name was Patricia Holloway.
How could they do
She lived
this?
4 houses down from me on Cedar Brook
This
Lane.
changes
And she
everything.
had been on the HOA
I need to
board
be
for
strong.
7 consecutive years. 7 years. In that time, she had filed over 60 formal complaints against various neighbors. A number I
I have
only
to
learned
do
later
this.
through a public records request, but one that, when I heard it,
Listen, we
made
don't
every
have much
moment
time.
of what followed
What's
make
happening?
perfect sense.
Trouble's coming.
Patricia
You have to
was
leave.
not simply a rule
I'm
follower.
not leaving you.
She was a rule worshiper.
You must
She had
go
constructed
now.
her entire identity around the covenant documents and architectural guidelines of Cedar Brook Estates, and she enforced them with the cold, righteous certainty of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between the rules and herself. We had exchanged pleasantries over the years. A wave here, a brief comment about the weather there. She had once left a note on my door, politely worded, "I'll give her that," mentioning that my recycling bin had been left out an hour past the designated retrieval time. I had thanked her and moved on. I thought nothing of it.
All clear
I
here,
thought she
proceeding
was
with
simply
patrol.
particular. I had no idea what particular
Unit 12,
really
the
looked like
dispatch,
until the
heading
night
towards
my brother
145
Marcus came to
Elm.
visit. Marcus drove up from Atlanta on a Friday
Officer,
evening.
please,
He
you have
pulled his
to
dark
listen.
blue sedan
Sir,
to the
calm
curb in front
down.
of my house.
What is the problem?
The curb.
There's no
not the
time.
driveway,
Someone's in my
because
house.
my wife's car and my own were
All right,
already parked
stay here. I'll
inside,
check it out.
and our single-car driveway had no room to spare. It was a Friday night. He was staying through Sunday. The car was clean, properly registered, and positioned completely parallel to the curb. Wheels turned correctly, not blocking any driveway or fire hydrant. It was, by any reasonable measure, a non-event. But when I looked out my front window just before midnight and saw Patricia Holloway standing on the sidewalk in a belted trench coat, photographing my brother's car from multiple angles like she was building a legal case, I felt the first cold pull of dread settle somewhere beneath my sternum. I didn't know it yet, but she had already sent her first email to the HOA board. The letter arrived in my mailbox the following Monday. Official HOA stationery, the Cedar Brook Estates crest embossed at the top in gold. I stood at the end of my driveway and read it in the morning sun, still holding my coffee, and felt something between disbelief and a slow-burning irritation begin to ignite behind my eyes. It was a formal warning notice. Violation. Section 4.7b of the Cedar Brook Estates Community Covenant. Vehicles shall not be parked on public curb space adjacent to residential lots for periods exceeding 12 hours without prior written approval from the HOA board. The notice stated that a vehicle registered to a non-resident had been observed parked in violation of this section from approximately 8:47 p.m. Friday through 9:15 a.m. Saturday, a period of 12 hours and 28 minutes. The notice further stated that this was my first formal warning and that subsequent violations could result in fines beginning at $150 per occurrence. I read it twice. Then I stood there for a moment in the silence of the morning, listening to a mockingbird somewhere in the oak tree above me, and I breathed. Marcus had left Sunday afternoon. His car had been parked in front of my home for 1.5 days, a normal, unremarkable visit for my brother that I had never once imagined could generate official documentation. I went inside, pulled up the HOA covenant on my laptop, and read section 4.7 in its entirety. The rule existed, that much was true. It was buried on page 31 of a 57-page document that I suspected fewer than 10% of residents had ever read completely. But it was there. I decided to handle it properly. I drafted a polite email to the HOA board explaining that the vehicle had belonged to a visiting family member, that I was unaware of the 12-hour restriction, and that I would ensure future visitors utilize the guest parking area on Elm Court, which was 3 blocks away. I sent it that evening and considered the matter resolved. Patricia Holloway apparently did not. The following Saturday, my wife Elena's cousin stopped by for a birthday lunch. She parked on the curb. She was there for 4 hours. I didn't think twice about it. 4 hours was well within the 12-hour window, and I had already briefed every potential visitor about the rule in my email to the board. But at approximately the 2-hour mark, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw Patricia standing on the sidewalk across the street, arms folded, staring at the parked car with an expression I can only describe as prosecutorial. I walked outside. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice even. "Everything okay?" She turned to look at me slowly, as though she had been expecting me. "I'm just observing, Daniel," she said. Her voice was clipped and precise, each word measured. "It's well within my rights as a board member to monitor covenant compliance. My cousin is visiting for a few hours," I said. "She'll be gone long before the 12-hour window." Patricia smiled, not warmly. "That's what they all say," she replied, and turned back to stare at the car. I stood there for a beat, unsure what to say to that, and then went back inside. Elena looked at me from across the kitchen island with raised eyebrows. "What did she say?" she asked. I told her. Elena's expression went very still in the way it does when she's choosing not to say exactly what she's thinking. The cousin left at 3. Patricia was gone by 3:15. A week passed. Then my neighbor on the opposite side, a quiet retired teacher named Mr. Okafor, mentioned to me over the fence one evening that Patricia had stopped by to ask if he had noticed any ongoing parking issues at my address. He said she had her notepad out. He said he had told her no, there were no issues, and that I was one of the most considerate neighbors on the street. He seemed embarrassed, even recounting it. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. I thanked him and felt something shift in me. This was no longer about a parking rule. The following Friday, my brother Marcus called to say he was passing through town again and would love to stop by for dinner. I told him about the parking situation and said he was absolutely welcome. I had already arranged with Elena's mother, who lived 10 minutes away, to let him park at her house and drive over with her. Problem solved. He arrived without a car at my door. It was almost comical. But Patricia must have been watching, because the next morning I found a handwritten note tucked under my front doormat. Not an official HOA notice, just a plain index card, in tight, precise handwriting. It read, "I know you're trying to be clever, Daniel. The community has rules for a reason. Some of us take that seriously." I sat down at my kitchen table with that index card in my hand and held it for a long time. My coffee went cold beside me. Elena came downstairs, read it over my shoulder, and said nothing for several seconds. Then she said, very quietly, "This has gone somewhere different." She was right. It had, and I had the slow, gathering sense that we were approaching some kind of moment, that the thing building between Patricia Holloway and me could not simply be absorbed and diffused forever. Something was going to break. I just didn't know yet what it would be or who it would break. 3 days later, Patricia made the mistake that changed everything. It was a Tuesday night, and I had a work call that ran until nearly 10 o'clock. When I finally closed my laptop and exhaled, I heard Elena downstairs talking in a low, tense voice on the phone. I came down to find her standing at the kitchen window, curtains pulled slightly aside, her face drawn tight. "Someone's blocking our driveway," she said. "Hand over the phone's receiver." I called non-emergency police. "There's a truck parked halfway across our apron. I can't get out." I went to the window. Across the street, not in front of my home, but directly in front of Patricia Holloway's house, was a large white pickup truck. It was parked along the curb with its rear end extending past Patricia's property line and angling slightly into the neighboring driveway. It had been there when I glanced out earlier around 8, and it was still there now. I had assumed it belonged to whoever was visiting her. But what was more interesting, far more interesting, was what I noticed when I looked more carefully. The truck was not the problem. The problem was the car. Patricia's own silver sedan was parked at the curb in front of her house, directly below the street lamp, in a way I had never seen before. Both her garage and her driveway appeared empty. Her car was at the curb, and it had been there since at least the previous evening, because I realized with a sudden crystalline clarity that I had seen it there when I took out the recycling on Monday night. I walked back to my laptop, opened my browser, and pulled up the Cedarbrook Estates Covenant. Section 4.7b. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened the email thread I had with the HOA board from weeks earlier. I found the board secretary's contact information, and, on a hunch that felt almost like reflex, I sent a quiet inquiry. Had any variance or written approval been granted to any residents on Cedarbrook Lane for extended curb parking in recent weeks? I sent it and didn't expect a reply until morning. The police officer arrived around 10:30 regarding Elena's concern about the partially blocked apron. He confirmed that while the truck was not in technical violation of city code, it wasn't fully blocking access. He'd leave a courtesy notice. As he was walking back to his cruiser, I stepped out and mentioned, almost casually, that I had a question about curb parking enforcement in the community. He paused. "Are you the one who received the HOA warning a few weeks back?" he asked. I blinked. "Yes, how did you?" "We had a call from an HOA board member requesting a welfare check and parking enforcement on this block around that time," he said, consulting something briefly on his phone. "Complaint was filed about recurring violations at this address." He looked at me steadily. We reviewed it and found no city code violations at the time. I didn't know she had called the police on me. I hadn't known that. I stood there on my driveway in the October night air, and I felt something very cold and very clear settle over me. "Officer," I said carefully, "the woman who made that complaint. I believe her own vehicle has been parked at the curb in front of her residence for over 24 hours, possibly longer. Our HOA has a 12-hour restriction. I don't want to be that person, but given the context..." He looked across the street. He looked at Patricia's sedan under the street lamp. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Do you have documentation of when it was first parked?" he asked. I did not, but Mr. Okafor did. I'm not proud of what happened next in the sense of taking pleasure in it, but I am grateful for it. It turned out that Mr. Okafor, the retired teacher who had lived on this street for 22 years, had begun keeping a quiet log of Patricia's activities after she had come to him with her notepad asking questions about me. He was a meticulous man, a former science teacher, and he had written down dates and times in a small spiral notebook with the same careful precision he had once used to grade lab reports. He had noted Patricia's sedan parked at the curb beginning Monday at 7:20 p.m. It was now Tuesday, 10:45 p.m., 27 hours and 25 minutes. The following morning, I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board. I attached a time-stamped photograph I had quietly taken the night before, Mr. Okafor's signed written statement, and a respectful cover letter noting that the same section of the covenant under which I had received a formal warning had, to my knowledge, been violated by a sitting board member for over 27 consecutive hours without any indication of prior written approval. By that afternoon, I had received an email from the board chair, not Patricia, notably, acknowledging receipt of my complaint and informing me that an emergency board review had been convened. What I did not expect was for it to become public. The annual Cedarbrook Estates neighborhood meeting was scheduled for that Thursday evening, 2 days later, at the community clubhouse. Patricia Holloway ran those meetings. She had run every one for 7 years. She arrived in a burgundy blazer, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, a printed agenda in her hand. She took her seat at the head table with the confident authority of someone who had never once been questioned in that room. The board chair, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Kim, opened the meeting. He went through 3 agenda items in the usual manner. And then, before Patricia could move to the next item, Gerald cleared his throat and said, "We need to address a compliance matter that was brought to the board's attention this week." Patricia looked up from her papers. Her expression was composed but alert. Gerald read the complaint aloud. Every word, the covenant section, the timestamps, Mr. Okafor's statement, the photographs. He read it in the careful, neutral tone of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it correctly. The room, maybe 40 residents, was absolutely silent. Patricia's face went through several stages in rapid succession. First, the composed blankness of someone waiting for context. Then something flickering across her eyes that might have been recognition. Then color rising in her neck, moving upward. She set her papers down with deliberate steadiness and said, "That vehicle was parked there due to a mechanical issue that required. Was a written approval submitted to the board?" Gerald asked. He wasn't unkind. He was simply precise. A pause. A long pause. No, I was unaware." The same section you cited in a formal warning issued to Mr. Marsh in September requires prior written approval for any extension beyond 12 hours, regardless of reason, Gerald said. The board is required to apply the covenant consistently. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it. The silence in that room was extraordinary, the kind of silence that has texture and weight, the kind that people remember. Patricia, Gerald said quietly, you're a valued member of this board, but we can't selectively enforce the covenant. That's the foundation of what we do here. She did not respond. She looked down at her agenda. And in 22 years of living on Cedarbrook Lane, according to Mr. Okafor, who told me everything afterward with quiet satisfaction, no one had ever seen Patricia Holloway without something to say. The formal outcome of the complaint was straightforward. Patricia Holloway received the same first warning notice that I had received. Same HOA letterhead, same gold crest, same covenant citation. Gerald Kim told me this privately, via email, with the measured language of someone committed to procedural fairness. He also noted, without elaboration, that the board would be reviewing its complaint submission process to ensure that all filings went through the full board rather than being processed at the discretion of a single member. That second sentence, quiet and bureaucratic as it was, meant everything. It meant that for 7 years, Patricia had been operating with a degree of unilateral authority that the board was only now examining. It meant that 60-plus complaints had been filed, processed, and action with Patricia as the primary driver, the primary reviewer, and sometimes the primary enforcer, a loop of power that had likely gone unchallenged simply because no one had ever turned the lens around. Within 2 weeks, the board voted to restructure its complaint review process. All complaints would now require a 2-member review before a formal warning was issued. A resident could also submit a written response before any warning was finalized in their record. These were reasonable, modest changes, the kind that should have existed all along, and they passed with a 5-to-1 vote. Patricia cast the one dissenting vote. She remained on the board, technically, but something had shifted in the invisible architecture of authority that she had spent years building. At the next monthly meeting, the first one after the community meeting, she arrived without her burgundy blazer. She sat slightly back from the table rather than at the center of it. She spoke less. When she did speak, other board members asked follow-up questions they never would have asked before. The dynamic in that room had quietly, permanently changed. I didn't celebrate. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story where I feel triumphant, where I savor the reversal and the public moment and the look on her face, and I'd be lying if I said I felt nothing. I did feel something, but it wasn't triumph. It was more like relief, and underneath the relief, something more complex that I've spent some time trying to name accurately. Mr. Okafor and I spoke about it one evening about a week after everything settled, standing at the fence between our yards in the fading light of a November afternoon. He was a quiet man who chose his words carefully, and he said something I've thought about many times since. The problem with people like her, he said, isn't that they believe in rules. Rules matter. It's that they use rules as a weapon against the people they've decided don't belong, and then exempt themselves from those same rules because in their mind, the rules were never really about fairness. They were about control. He paused and looked out at the street. The moment she filed that first complaint against you was the moment she stopped being a rule enforcer and became something else entirely. He was right. And I think the reason the whole experience affected me as deeply as it did, beyond the stress, beyond the indignation, was that I had wanted to believe Cedarbrook Estates was something it wasn't quite. I had wanted to believe the HOA was a neutral system, a framework of shared expectations that protected everyone equally. And in theory, that's what it is supposed to be. But any system is only as fair as the people who administer it. And when those people lose sight of fairness, when they start to believe that their authority is personal rather than structural, the system becomes something very different without ever changing its name. My brother Marcus visited again in December for the holidays. He parked in my driveway. I had rearranged the garage to make room, which I should have done long ago, honestly. We had dinner, and I told him the whole story start to finish, and he shook his head slowly and said, "Man, all of this started because I parked my car on the street for a day and a half." And I laughed, genuinely laughed, because when you say it like that, it sounds almost absurd. And maybe it is, but that's how these things work. They start small, and then someone decides to make something small into something significant. And the choice of who gets targeted and who gets protected reveals everything about who that someone really is. Elena and I still live in Cedarbrook Estates. We have no plans to leave. The oak trees are still beautiful in the fall, and the mockingbird is still in the tree above my driveway. And most of my neighbors are decent, ordinary people who simply want to live their lives in peace. That's all I ever wanted. That's all Marcus wanted when he pulled his car to the curb on that Friday evening, tired from the drive, looking forward to dinner with his brother. I still wave to Patricia when I see her. She waves back. It is a careful, measured exchange, not warm, not hostile. Just two people who understand something about each other now that wasn't visible before. I don't wish her harm. I don't need her to apologize, though I doubt one is coming. What I needed, what I got, was fairness. Not revenge, just the same treatment anyone else would receive. Just the rules applied the same way to everyone, regardless of who filed the complaint and who received it. That's not a radical thing to ask for. It shouldn't be. But sometimes you have to fight surprisingly hard for something that's simple, in a quiet neighborhood with nice trees and a gold-crested letterhead, on a street where everything looks peaceful from the outside. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking places are where the most important battles get fought.